Back on now, apologies. This is Josh Ellis from the Metropolitan Planning Council. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and for those of you that have been on for other events in this series, thank you. This is our third event. Today we are focusing on issues of stormwater and water quality in the face of COVID-19 and broader efforts at resiliency, and we're joined today by partners from Equity Legal Services and then Elevate Energy and the Natural Resources Defense Council, who've been partners on this entire series. If you have not been able to attend the previous two events in this series, you can see what they were here. I should note that we are recording this event and recorded the other two, and shortly after today's event, we'll be posting all three of them. Links to the actual events, the PowerPoints, the Q&A, and we'll send that out to everyone that registered for all three. We are using the Q&A function today. If you go to, should be the top of your screen, it may be the bottom, but if you hover over it, you should see a box there, a little Q&A box with dialogue clouds, and you can post a question there and we'll make sure to answer it. If it's a clarification question about something that someone just said, we'll try to insert that into the presentation as best we can. If it is a question more for discussion afterwards, then we'll handle it in the Q&A that follows. From that, I'm gonna get us going. So a couple comments from me to kick things off. Again, my name is Josh Ellis, Vice President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. We didn't exactly plan to have this event in the middle of the rainiest May on record, but yeah, we are having this event in the middle of the rainiest May on record. We broke that record today. The previous record was set last year, and that record broke the previous year's record. So you can pretty much count on May being an incredibly rainy month in the Chicago area, at least. Lessons from that include: one, we should know that it's coming. Two, don't plan outdoor weddings in May. But the effects of this in the last couple of days have been severe, and you've probably seen footage of maybe the Chicago River overflowing its banks into some parking garages downtown, riverine flooding elsewhere. You see a photo here of a flooded viaduct. Far less visible in social media or the media are the hundreds and probably thousands, to be honest, of basement backups and other very localized and very personal flooding that we're experiencing throughout the region and throughout the state. The map that you see here on the right is one story of flooding. This is a map of combined sewer overflows in the region. There's a tool on MWRD's website, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District here in Cook County. And this shows where there have been discharges into the river system as a result of substantial rainfall. You'll note here, this is a map from the other day, substantial overflows on the Chicago River and the Calumet River. If we were to go to that tool, and I'll post the link to it once we get in to Nicole's presentation, you can take a look. There haven't been, even in the last 4 days, combined sewer overflows on the Calumet River in the southern part of the region. That may be due in part to an increased amount of open space there. It may be due in part to the deep tunnel system being fully operational on the Calumet. It's not quite done for the Chicago and Des Plaines system, but there haven't been combined sewer overflows on the Calumet River, which is a good thing. At the same time, there have been and continue to be basement backup upon basement backup upon basement backup, and that doesn't show up on this map. Where it does show up is in this chart at the lower left, which is 311 calls for wet basement conditions, wet weather conditions, flooding conditions. And you can see this spike from essentially 0 up into the 500s in the last couple of days. I pulled this from May 17th, and there have surely been more since then. The reality of this is that flooding is not one story. Solutions to flooding is not one story, and there's not one solution. We have major infrastructure issues, we have household issues, we have community issues, we have regional issues, and we're going to grapple with all of those today. Many of the things that undermine our ability to be resilient in the face of things like climate change, so including rain, and we have had changing rain patterns in this region in the last many years, heat, cold, etc. Those same forces that undermine our resilience in the face of those also undermine our resilience in the face of COVID-19, which is an acute shock that we haven't had in a long time, and other chronic stressors. And these things, continued racial and economic inequities, tax policy, land use decisions, variable and insufficient government capacity, over-governance and under-governance, basic compliance and oversight failings, failing infrastructure, all of these things combine in different ways with, yes, a large amount of water to manifest themselves in very different ways across our region and across the state. And today, my fellow panelists, Nicole from Equity Legal Services in East St. Louis, Malia Giersma from NRDC, and Ann McKibben from Elevate Energy are going to explore some of these issues that are undermining our ability to manage flooding, but really are undermining our ability to manage any sort of acute shock or chronic stressor that our region and state face. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to pass it off to Nicole, who's going to get into a story from downstate that some of us may be aware of, some of us may be totally unaware of, but I think tells a lot of this story. So hand it off to Nicole and Malia to talk to us about chronic flooding and sewage issues in Centerville, Illinois. Take it away. Nicole, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, Josh?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, let's just do that then. Okay. I'm Nicole. I'm with Equity Legal Services. And I don't know if Malia is popping up on the screen too here momentarily, but I'm located in St. Clair County.
I think my participating mutes Nicole, so I'll go ahead and.
And Centerville is also located in St. Clair County. And so if we go to the next slide, what we have in Centerville is kind of like what Josh described in Chicago area, only in Centerville is a much smaller population in a much smaller geographic area. And so I thought that the term resilience to describe some of this, the discussion we're having today was very timely, just because when we talk about the residents in Centerville, that's often how we describe them, because they're very resilient and patient, really when they shouldn't have to be, right? So I also noticed the 63 different locations of where sewage is being dumped in the Chicago rivers in that slide that Josh had, and that is very similar to what's happening in Centerville. As you see with the slide, there's sewage. They have a sewage and stormwater issue. I think the difference with Centerville is that it is it's really solely an infrastructure issue. So their flooding is not coming from the Mississippi River, although that is a conception that some folks have. It's solely from the sanitary, sewer, and stormwater infrastructure. And so it doesn't have to rain for residents in Centerville to be flooded with stormwater or with sewage in their homes or lawns, but then if it does rain, it exacerbates those issues. So when we look at this slide, when we were coming in and first meeting the residents, upon first glance, or at first blush, you wouldn't realize that all these different issues start to, there's a lot more that comes with sewage and the flooding, right? The residents have a lot of issues and significant concerns about their home values, right? So the water is eroding away the foundations of their homes. There's a lot of pest issues. They can't keep their windows open during the summertime. They can't allow their grandkids to play outside. All these different things that I think we probably take for granted. All these different issues come from the sewage that's sitting on the lands and throughout the yard, as well as the stormwater that's sitting in stagnant in ditches and things like that. And so those are like the two main issues in Centerville, as well as potential drinking water quality issues, which is another issue that our team is working on with NRDC, where Malia works, as well as Earth Justice. So if we go to the next slide, it's one of the residents that's Walter Bird, and that's another, his friend Rico, who's helped pushing him out. And that's usually what it looks like, although there's usually a lot more water. But that's one of the neighborhoods where the residents in Centerville live. And, you know, one of the approaches that our team has really used is we talk about identifying ways to address the issue, as it's completely resident-led. And so the residents formed a committee, and we suggested that they do so, and then they listed all of their priorities. So what's important to them for us to identify and fix. And so they listed about 14 priorities. And so with those priorities, that's how we kind of attack how we're going to address litigation or policy, right? And so that's how we choose to figure out how we're going to identify ways to address the flooding and the sewage. And so that's how we, as a team, how we figure out, we go back to the table and we say, okay, well, the residents say they want the flooding and the sewage to stop. They're concerned about the drinking water, right? Which is why we have a bottled water drive going on at the Urban League right now. That's been going on since October. So it really is community led. We take what the residents tell us they want, and then we work around that, not the other way around. That's how it's worked from the beginning, and that's really how it continues to work. So yeah, the next two slides are, they're pages from a booklet that some Harvard interns we had over last summer. We directed them on what we wanted. We wanted something that would tell the residents' stories, something that gave the history of everything that was going on, so we didn't have to continually repeat it, but something that resonated with folks when the stories were told. And if you go to the next page, it tells the residents' stories, right? So it talks about each of them, and this is just a sample of the different residents who are active in the committee, about what their stories and what has happened. And we really wanted something that allowed them to tell their stories and what had happened. And although each of them suffer from different issues, flooding and sewage, they each have very unique experiences as to what has happened. So for instance, if you see on the right hand, that's a sewage pipe that continuously overflows with sewage and has for at least 10 years in someone's front yard, right? And so someone may be dealing with sewage and flooding in one yard, and the next door neighbor literally next to them might not have any sewage issues. It's just flooding. And I say just flooding, but it's all significant. And so as a team, these issues are extremely complex because there's no easy solution for it. And so that's why we have put as many people at the table as we can, like NRDC or Justice, some scientists, to try to figure out what's the best way to figure out what's going wrong here, because the infrastructure has been failing for at least 50 years from the residents that we've talked to. At least they've been dealing with flooding and sewage for at least 50 years. And with, you know, city officials who don't want to do anything, we kind of have to work around that. So that's kind of a broad overview of what our work is like in Centerville. Aaliyah?
Thanks so much, Nicole. And if we could go to the next slide. I wanted to, in the next slide after that, this is another slide from the booklet. So I wanted to pick up some of the themes that Nicole hit on, and especially the community-led nature of the work that we're doing. I think the key here is that the residents have an extraordinary amount of knowledge about the problems in their community and what is exacerbating them. And what we try to do is line up what the residents are telling us with what we know of how things are supposed to work, and then start looking at solutions for it. But I think one of the real things to bring out here in talking about these water issues in light of COVID is simply that, you know, Flint was not just about drinking water. COVID is not about virus preparedness. Essentially, what these events and what they've highlighted for us is that truly the racial injustices that continue to impact our country are making the lives of certain people virtually unlivable in the conditions that we're seeing in places like Centerville, that essentially, if you go back to Josh's list at the beginning, the racial and economic inequity piece overlays all of the other items on that list. And so what we've seen in Centerville is just a massive collapse of the systems that are supposed to deliver things like functioning stormwater management and functioning sewage systems. And so as somebody who works in public health, what I think about is the fact, again, that vulnerabilities are not individual, they're not separable, and they're not simply additive. That folks like those in Centerville are facing a long, long list of interlinking vulnerabilities, which largely stem from the fact that they are Black and that they are poor and that society has largely left them behind. And one of the things that we look at in sort of disaster preparedness is the fact that one additional finger on the scales can just tip people who are in these situations over the edge. And so, as you could see, Centerville was dealing with overwhelming water impacts even before the virus hit. And we were working together as a team with the residents to try to bring some of the relief to this system. And I think what COVID has sort of brought into the mix is yet another reminder that virus impacts are not being experienced equally across racial or economic lines. And what it started doing for us with the Centerville work is thinking about first, what are the residents themselves going to be experiencing now that they're being told to shelter in place? You know, these are people whose homes are virtually unlivable. Their yards are filled with mosquitoes and stench, and we're now telling them they can't leave. So imagine that that's your situation when all of a sudden the governor says, stay in your home. So we were trying to think about ways that we could at least try to stave off some of the flooding and sewage impacts that we knew we were heading into with the rainy season, and try to minimize to the extent that we could some of those impacts that we knew were coming, so that at least if the residents had to stay home, things wouldn't be quite as bad as if we hadn't done anything. We also were very concerned that there could actually be significant virus spread in the East St. Louis metro area. It's immediately across the river from St. Louis. If folks have looked at the Illinois DPH's maps of the virus spread, that area of the state is another one that pops out. It doesn't have anywhere near the level of cases of the Chicago area, but it is a significant concentration of virus cases and of fatalities. And then this got us thinking again about, well, okay, so we have the virus hitting us at the same time that the rainy season is coming. What the heck is emergency response going to look like? What are the first responders going to do if you layer on virus risks and threats on top of just the basic flooding and sewage issues that they're dealing with on an ongoing basis? How do you make sure that the residents are protected, that the first responders are protected, when all of a sudden you're going to have these conditions that go against the very shelter-in-place order that is applying across the state to protect everybody else? So if you could go to the next slide, please.
Can I actually ask you a clarifying question, Malia?
Sure.
Have you seen any guidance being provided by floodplain managers, stormwater professionals, public health? Have you seen it in the local context there or anywhere else? Because I have not, and I've been asking folks, to be clear.
I have not. I will say I have not had the time to ask folks, but certainly I haven't seen anyone broadcasting, this is how we're going to do temporary housing for folks rescued from their homes in light of the virus. So no, not so far. So we started trying to think really quickly about what we could do to try to address these combined problems, but also, to be perfectly honest, to keep on track the work that was happening before the virus hit, recognizing that things were just not acceptable prior to this issue, and that getting hit with this massive virus response could very well derail some of the very important work that was being done to try to identify the problems and fix them in Centerville. And so Nicole and her partner Kalila had already undertaken an amazing effort to try to get emergency pumps to the local residents for their own use, because government officials were not providing emergency pumps, and all the pumps, I think about at least 50% of the pumps in the system are dysfunctional. So they had obtained pumps, were ready to deploy them, and then the virus hit, and there were a lot of questions about, well, when residents are trying to help each other, and that help requires them to congregate and use pumps or to work together to clean out a ditch, what can they do? And so we realized we were running into these problems at the local level. And as Nicole mentioned as well, there was an effort underway to make sure that, along with provision of drinking water that was happening prior to the virus hitting, the same distributors, the Urban League started providing a food pantry option for residents so that they could get both drinking water and food assistance in one stop outside of their homes. But again, we started, we were seeing that we're running into these log jams, these bottlenecks that were not surprising at all in terms of deploying more kind of low-hanging fruit, off the shelf, near-term measures to stave off flooding. And so we began to reach out more and work with Senator Duckworth's office in particular to figure out how can we get emergency support moving when we have a log jam because the local government is non-responsive and is not triggering the emergency response up and down the chain. We also started looking at, okay, well, there's going to be this huge injection of federal funds into a number of pre-existing programs and also creation of new programs. How is that money going to get distributed within the state? What of those pools of funds can we start trying to look at for additional water assistance? And then also, just generally speaking, making sure that, as Josh said, that people who are supposed to be planning for flooding emergencies realize these things are going to have to be dealt with together now, that we're going to be having flooding at the same time that we have the virus hitting us. Next slide, please. And so again, going kind of up the ladder, we also work together with both Nicole and the local residents to assess the problems that they were facing and try to translate those in some of the policy recommendations that we were making at the state level. So folks may be aware that there was a letter sent into Governor Pritzker's office with a long list of asks related to water. A number of the asks related to drinking water in particular, and I think that's one area where there's been a lot of attention to the need to ensure safe and reliable water service in the house so people could do things like wash their hands or shower while they're sheltering in place. We wanted to make sure that the flooding and sewage issues were also on that water priority list, again, because you don't get to wash your hands in your house if the foundation of your house is getting washed away by floodwaters. You don't get to wash your hands. Washing your hands is not very effective if when you go out in your yard, you're getting literally raw sewage on your hands if you try to do anything with your garden. And so we started including those asks on the list of items being raised with the governor's office. And we also asked for a whole long list of items related to existing stormwater and wastewater compliance obligations to make sure the systems were still having to meet their legal obligations, and that for those who were on track to comply, that they would get additional assistance to stay in compliance, to make sure that the virus impacts on their staffing, on their revenues and whatnot, were not preventing them from providing protections from floodwater and stormwater. And then finally, at the top level on the federal end, we again translated all of these asks that were being developed from the local level up to the long list of COVID-related reform issues that have been or assistance and reform issues that have been on the table since about February or March. And those are, I would say, are way too long of a list for me to go through at this point. We do have materials talking about all the different positions that NRDC and groups like ours have taken. But I think the real key at the federal level is, again, that rather than looking at what have been traditionally the areas of water advocacy like the State Revolving Fund, like the more standard Clean Water Act programs or Safe Drinking Water Act programs. We were really looking at these broader community building programs at the federal level and asking, what do communities that are facing all kinds of challenges, communities that look like Centerville, where could they reasonably go for support? And by and large, they would need to seek out grant funds. They are not in a position to take on significant loans. So we started looking at a lot of the grant programs that explicitly are allowed to be used for water infrastructure projects, such as the Community Development Block Grant Program, which, as some folks may know, provides direct assistance in grant form for wastewater and stormwater projects, and has been used, in fact, in Illinois, in Will County in particular, to help out a community that in some ways looked like Centerville, and it had decades of disrepair and poor water service. So I think the main takeaway of this is that we were trying to look at communities that by and large are not being served by the systems even before disasters hit. We were trying to start from the residents themselves, ask them what they need, where they were getting caught up, where they were hitting roadblocks, and look at the asks that we could make at all levels of the government. Once there was this big focus on, okay, who needs assistance, who needs help, and say, this is what some communities are experiencing. These water problems are threatening their quality of life. The virus just layers another disruption on top of what's already hitting them. And we should be addressing those near-term needs now, and we should be trying to create a new system after this all hits us that lifts up people in these situations, gives them reliable water services and a place to live that's not full of raw sewage. So
Malia, thank you. We have a question before we go to Ann. This could be for either you or Nicole. One, thank you, Elizabeth, for submitting it. And everyone else, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. Since you've made these requests, has the Illinois Department of Public Health or IEPA or IDNR or any other relevant acronym organization responded in any meaningful way, or has there been an uptick in support given that overlay of the existing flooding and sewage issues with COVID-19?
Well, Josh would know as I do that there's not been a response so far to the formal ask that's gone into Pritzker's office. I will say that, and Nicole can address this too, Senator Duckworth's office in particular continues to try to bring the people who are more directly involved in Centerville to the table to continue the conversations that were going on there. So, I think we're still, a lot of these asks I think are relatively new. I think what we were concerned about was that the issues didn't seem to be on anybody's radar screen. And so I don't think we were expecting any kind of immediate response of like, oh, right, here's our plan for how we're going to rescue people in boats while protecting them from the virus and then put them in temporary shelters. But I think we're hopeful that that response is coming and doesn't just get sort of swept off to the side as people are talking about reopening plans.
Thank you. We're going to segue now to Ann McKibben from Elevate Energy, who's going to talk about some somewhat similar issues here a little closer to Chicago, in fact, in Chicago, and some things that we can do about it. Ann, take it away.
Sure thing. Thanks, Josh. I think, let's see if we could go to my first slide. Malaya and Nicole have really laid out in a very practical, sort of concrete way, a whole host of the vulnerabilities of our water and wastewater system that interact with each other to, multiply the problem for everyone involved. So I'll just touch on those a little bit, and then I'm going to give an example of a project that offers one kind of solution to some of these problems, and then we'll discuss state and federal stimulus a little bit. So yeah, vulnerabilities, as we've discussed, we have in this country millions of people now who lack access to clean drinking water, and we're losing ground on that. I think that was discussed in more detail in one of the previous webinars in this series. but you should know that that is a continuing problem of just getting clean water. Flooding, as you've seen, way too common, way too costly. We also have a tremendous problem with lead service lines in Illinois, which we also discussed in a previous webinar. So when this webinar is over and all those recordings go out, I would encourage you to take a look at them. All of these problems have a disproportionate impact on communities of color and low wealth communities. In addition to the sort of multiplicative impact we've got on those communities, Illinois has a very large number of very small water utilities, and we are a little concerned about water utility operations and their staffing. There was a shortage of water plant operators before the crisis, and so now some of them get sick, it can be a bigger problem. So there's a whole bunch of vulnerabilities to these systems that we need to sort of think about together when we're thinking about the solutions together. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chatham Rain Ready pilot. It's just one example of one kind of a program that can provide solutions for some of these problems. I think, as Josh mentioned at the beginning, there are different kinds of flooding that have different solutions. In Centerville, you have a storm water sewage infrastructure problem. In other areas, you may have impervious cover that prevents water from sinking into the ground. There's just a whole different bunch of causes for flooding. And so the solutions have to be, to some extent, custom. So I'll talk about this pilot that's happening in the community of Chatham. Chatham is a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Residents there are predominantly African American. They're middle income, and it's a really strong community. There's a lot of community organizations, a lot of strong social bonds in the community, so it really has some great assets in that way. Unfortunately, it was built on a low-lying area, and half of the area is now covered with impervious cover, so water can't sink to the ground when it comes out of the sky or from anywhere else. So it is plagued by urban flooding right now. So this pilot is an initiative of our colleagues over at the Center for Neighborhood Technology. It's being run with support of the City of Chicago and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. And Rain Ready services will be provided by my organization. We do a lot of construction management at Elevate Energy, so we'll be helping out. But the pilot is to provide stormwater management solutions to a small number of pre-selected properties in Chatham that are specifically selected for the flooding characteristics of the area. So the pilot's been approved for funding, but it hasn't yet begun outreach to selected homeowners, partly because we can't safely go into people's homes right now. So the timeline is in flux, both because of the virus, also to the extent we'll be installing rain gardens. We have to think about the growing season, which runs from May to October. So I wanted to recognize real quick the Center for Neighborhood Technology and point to its urban flooding webpage for folks who are interested in this topic. They've done just a tremendous amount of work, including quite a bit of research over the last 6 months that they've published on the kinds of mechanisms that we'll be talking about in the Chatham Rain Ready pilot, on the disproportionate impacts that urban flooding has, and on financing for these kinds of mechanisms and how to pay for them. So that's definitely worth a look. So in this pilot, the pilot will install on homes that have been chosen for the project a mix of some low-cost strategies like disconnecting downspouts. If we've got folks who are on the call who aren't from Northern Illinois, I don't know, I should just explain that, I think, because it was, when I moved here, it was the first thing. I hadn't seen it before. But we have downspouts come off your gutters, the water hits the gutter, it goes into the downspout, and the downspout goes straight into the ground and straight into the storm sewer. So it never has a chance to even soak into the ground. So if you can disconnect those downspouts and redirect that water to an area that's not the storm sewer, it can be really helpful. And it's a pretty low cost little project. But it'll also do a lot of more extensive measures, such as dry wells. In its simplest form, a dry well is a hole in the ground that you fill with gravel, make it look nice on top. Water goes into the well and seeps in between the gravel, and it just holds it there instead of having it go straight to the storm sewer. so that it can over time soak into the surrounding soil. It just gives the water a productive place to go, as opposed to the storm sewer. Also rain gardens and sewer backup prevention measures, because that's also a cause of flooding in Chatham. So the pilot will offer a variety of measures to these predetermined homes. It'll have a dedicated team of folks delivering the pilot and be pretty comprehensive in that we will be going to individual homes, talking with the homeowner and doing upgrades in the individual homes, as well as some neighborhood upgrades and community investments. But even that kind of a comprehensive look at a small geographic area, it is still just one kind of solution, because there are many kinds of flooding. But hopefully it's a solution that will be helpful for residents of the Chatham area.
And one clarifying question that came in. What you mentioned that the homes would be pre-selected for this. What is the process or the criteria for determining which homes in a neighborhood that is chronically afflicted by this? What's that process?
I have to tell you, I'm not.
Okay.
I don't know, but
all right.
I can see if I can find out.
Okay, we can find that out, and Cheryl, who submitted the question, we can make sure you get that. I believe Cheryl lives in Chatham and is particularly interested.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, we'll get that to you.
Cheryl, we'll follow up.
Cool. So this is one kind of program to address these sorts of problems, but yeah, let's talk about stimulus. Again, there are many different kinds of infrastructure investments that need to be made. And water and wastewater infrastructure is just such a good use for stimulus funding, specifically stimulus related to this crisis, of course, because of the direct connection to coronavirus prevention and care. You got to have water, clean water to wash up, and Malia describes the difficulties you can have keeping things clean when you've got flooding in your area. Water and wastewater infrastructure is also relatively labor intensive in that for projects of approximately the same investment, it employs more people than some other kinds of infrastructure projects. So when we're going into a recession and we've got a lot of folks who are newly unemployed, it's a great way to create a lot of relatively well-paying jobs. So it's a good use for stimulus money. Federal stimulus could come in a couple of forms and has come in a couple of forms. There's, of course, specific funding to specific existing or possibly new programs. Existing programs have already got some infrastructure there about how to get the money out, so that can be very helpful. And then there's the more generalized fiscal relief as states and local governments, the tax revenue is going to tank. And so there's been some work at the federal level to try to replace some of that money so that folks can keep working on the projects that they were working on before the virus. Of course, anytime you've got a short time period and short time frame, a lot of urgency to get money out the door quickly, there's the possibility that it'll be directed to just sort of the same old, or that it might not be administered as well as it otherwise would be. So there is a real need, I think, to keep eyes on that and to advocate for good governance and forward-thinking uses of funding. So we've had several virus-related stimulus acts at the federal level already, the biggest one being the CARES Act. That included $5 billion in community development block grant funding, $5 billion in CDBG funding, some of which could be used for water and sewer infrastructure. CDBG funding typically comes with some leeway on how to spend it, in some cases a good bit of leeway. So there is, again, room for advocacy there with grantees, which are cities, counties, or states, regarding the use of those funds. The HEROES Act, which was passed just very recently, in the last couple of days, by the House of Representatives, it includes some interesting items as well that we should watch. At least my few contacts in DC are telling me they don't expect the Senate to pass it, but do expect that it might serve as some sort of starting point for a Senate stimulus package. So it's useful to know what's in it. And I think it looks like a pretty strong stimulus in that it includes nearly $1 trillion in flexible funding for states and local governments. And that's money meant to kind of replace that tax revenue that's just disappeared overnight. It also includes $50 million to US EPA for environmental justice grants, or that would go to environmental justice communities. It includes $1.5 billion for direct water bill assistance to states, territories, and tribes. Again, that gets to the water affordability problem a little bit, certainly the immediate water affordability problem that we've talked about in previous webinars as well. The delivery mechanism for that bill assistance money is pretty unclear, so it'll be worth keeping an eye on that. And then it would include another $5 billion for CDBG grants to existing grantee communities. Another big source of funding for water and wastewater infrastructure, of course, is the state revolving loan funds. They're an important tool that I think our communities accustomed to dealing with. They're funded by the feds, and sometimes the state has some extra money to kick in there too. Adding to those funds facilitates, of course, new infrastructure projects, but there's also room to improve the administration of those funds. The revolving loan fund applications take quite a bit of technical expertise and some staff time. And with a lot of small water utilities, some of the most vulnerable communities just don't have that staff time, and they need technical assistance. So there's certainly a lot of room for helping the communities who most need the investment to be able to access the investment with that help. As far as funding, I know last year's state capital spending plan added quite a good bit of funding to our state revolving loan fund. It is the kind of thing that could receive additional funding from a federal stimulus as well. So that's worth noting. Another type of grant that we would love to see more money into coming from a federal stimulus is a US EPA WIN grants. And those are grants that are specifically about removing the lead in our water infrastructure. They can be used for lead service line removal. It's an existing program, and I believe in some cases folks are applying for WIN grants right now. It would be a great place to put some stimulus money. We'll see if that actually happens. State budgets, of course, we always look at state budgets for funding, but they are likely to be severely constrained. So federal stimulus, like I said, flexible stimulus is going to be needed to fill those holes so that our state budgets fund the things we thought they would fund. And then, of course, last year, Illinois passed a capital spending bill that did include some money for water revolving funds, a little for flood mitigation, and some for unsewered communities as well. And then finally, here in Illinois, we've got some Illinois legislation, Senate Bill 1532, which may have a name, but I just think of it as the lead bill. But it would create a mechanism to plan for and pay for lead service line replacements. That bill, MPC has worked to get that bill together along with Illinois Environmental Council and NRDC and others. That bill is unfortunately not expected to be addressed in the 3-day legislative session that we've got starting tomorrow, but hopefully it'll be taken up at a later time. It's certainly, folks put a lot of work into it, and it would set us down a really nice road towards getting rid of lead service lines in the state. So that's all I have, but I would love your questions, and if I can't answer them right off, I'll find you something.
Thanks, Ann. If you do have questions, make sure to submit them in the Q&A function. I just want to share a couple of final additional thoughts on a new approach that can be added to this, and then we'll move to the Q&A. And there's Ann's information if you want to follow up with her or learn more about any of the great work that Elevate Energy does. So I want to just talk about a different, another approach. I don't want to say different, that a lot of what we've been talking about in the previous presentations has been about a need for public government investment in infrastructure, often very large systems, sometimes small systems. And the reality is we manage stormwater through two really different ways. One is those public infrastructure projects, and the other in many places is by leveraging private real estate development. And at least here in Cook County, in the last, say, 10 years or so, a tremendous amount of stormwater management capacity to store, to slow down, to retain or detain water has been built as a function of private real estate development, either redevelopment, new development, or substantial redevelopment. And when those occur in the county, it triggers requirements for adding certain amounts of storage. And those requirements keep getting stronger and stronger because we keep modifying the rainfall data that supports them. And the reality is, every time we update the rainfall data that we use, we have to store more water because precipitation patterns are changing, and we have to account for those larger storms. I think I saw something the other day that what used to be considered a 100-year storm in Illinois is now considered a 15-year storm, simply based on the changing of which sort of recency of data that we use. Just to give you a sense of magnitude, just based on the math, looking at Cook County and the map you see here of Cook County is 1,635 square miles. St. Clair County, where Centerville is a little less than half that size. If 1 inch of rain fell consistently over all of Cook County, that's 28 billion, with a B, 28 billion gallons of water that needs to go somewhere. A lot of it will go into the ground, a lot of it will go into local sewer systems, but as you get more and more rainfall, a lot of it goes into the deep tunnel system, and a lot of it comes into people's properties or just sits on the surface. If you think about the amount of rain that we've had in the last couple days, and I saw something that suggested 8 inches of rain at O'Hare Airport, that's 227 billion gallons of water that needs to go somewhere. Again, if it fell consistently over the county. Keep in mind that MWRD's deep tunnel system, once finally operational, has 17.9 billion gallons of storage. So there just isn't a place for all this water to go, which means we don't have the luxury of choosing either or, big gray infrastructure systems, or holes in the ground, or green infrastructure, or this or that. The answer is we have to do it all. And so here's another approach I'm going to talk about real quickly. That is another way to do it, to be part of that toolbox. And it's stormwater credit trading. So when the private real estate development is built, the requirements have always suggested that their stormwater responsibility has to be met on the site of that development, irregardless of a couple of things. One, it's entirely possible that where you're building that real estate development has sufficient stormwater management capacity. There's no localized flooding. Perhaps it's in an area that has received a bunch of other investment in private real estate development recently, and there's abundant storage capacity for that water. It also means that if you have an area that doesn't get a lot of private real estate development, you're not getting that infrastructure investment because you're not getting the private development. So what we have done, and very recently, this is an effort of the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Nature Conservancy over the last 8 years, and it came to fruition in the last couple of weeks when we got a vote from MWRD to amend the county stormwater ordinance, so that in these two watersheds that you're seeing here, the Lower Des Plaines, which is in green, and the Little Calumet watershed in pinkish red, in those two areas, a real estate developer in one location, so long as they can demonstrate that they will do no harm, can buy credits for a stormwater facility that is built in another location. And what this should enable us to do is optimize the location of those stormwater systems so that they can be located in communities that need them most. It means that a private real estate development occurring one place could purchase credits. Someone will have to build that, the supply site, that stormwater facility, and then be able to sell credits into that market. And so a lot of what we're going to be doing, along with our partners at TNC and MWRD and others, is cultivating a pipeline of both supply and demand projects. It should also lower development costs in real estate markets that perhaps are not so as hot with a lot of activity as others. Or perhaps it's a lot of infill development close to train stations, weird parcel sizes, and it's hard to fit all of the stormwater management responsibilities in those sites, or it's cost prohibitive. A 500,000 gallon underground storage tank in one real estate market can kill a project, whereas in another real estate market, it's a rounding error. So our hope is that with this approach, we'll be able to optimize the location of these stormwater systems and encourage infill development in other areas to spur for wealth generation, job creation in communities that aren't seeing as much of it now. So this is literally just in the last couple of days that ordinance change happened, and we have a brave new world ahead of us. We'll probably be doing web events on that in the future with the Nature Conservancy, so stay tuned. But I just wanted to get in the mix now because it's new and it's an approach that doesn't require federal or state investment. It's a way to harness market activity and be smart about where we put our locations, stormwater locations. So I'm gonna turn off the PowerPoint at this point and invite our speakers to come back on, video and audio, for some Q&A. We are taking questions in the Q&A function, and then I have some to pose as well. So when Nicole rejoins us, we can get going. One of the questions I have goes back to one of the points that included in the overview slide that I shared at the beginning, which was about over-governance and under-governance. One of the realities we have in Illinois is that we have more total units of government than anybody in the land, everywhere in the nation, by far. Mm-hmm. And yet we find, particularly with issues of flooding, and I think more broadly water management, that despite the sheer amount of units of government, there are many problems that don't appear to be any single one unit of government's responsibility. And I'm just curious to see whether that holds true in the Centerville example, and whether this may be a moment to reconsider governance structures in specific locations or more broadly throughout the state. And I'll just open that up for anybody that wants to take it.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's timely. I think if anyone pays attention to downstate news, probably not. But there, you know, Centerville is in the middle of trying to merge, right? So there's a merger trying to happen between City of Centerville, townships no longer on the table, but City of Centerville, Allerton, Cahokia, and possibly there's another one out there. I don't, you know, for different reasons, there's many of us who don't believe that's necessarily in the best interest of the residents, right? So economically, yes, but when you have folks who are over a government who aren't being good stewards of it, right? Like, so you have this infrastructure that's been failing for 50 years in Allerton. Allerton is a village within Centerville. And so Allerton, City of Centerville, Township of Centerville, it's hard to believe that combining these or making these are gonna make them function any better. When the folks who've been over them have a hard time providing good oversight, right? And doing good with the money that they've been given. So I think I have a pretty cynical view of that, but others might have a different view.
I'll chime in on Nicole's points, because I think what we see, practically speaking, is that you need some economies of scale, right, to make a water system work. It's big infrastructure, it's costly infrastructure. And, you know, you see one version in Chicagoland where you've got MWRD in the city and these, you know, single big entities that run a lot of pipes and a lot of equipment. You have almost the exact opposite of that down in the East St. Louis area, where you've got one entity owns a wastewater treatment plant, another entity owns some of the pumps, another one owns some of the ditches, another one owns various parts of the distribution system. And, you know, the vast majority of them are dysfunctional.
Right.
So what do you do to pull that together into one functioning system that is responsive to local community needs? And we clearly have not, you know, I don't think any of us has like the solution to that. But I think certainly there are principles that we would want to work towards, like recognizing that you can't operate functioning systems when they're broken up to little pieces, and that much of the history of the local government in that area was to create lots of tiny municipalities simply because they couldn't then exert power against the industrials that were dominating the landscape. So it was built into the local government that these governments wouldn't be able to survive on their own, and it's proven out to be the case. Yeah. So how can we step in now and figure out what's the revised governance structure for a utility, like let alone all of the city, you know, the other local government functions that could deliver a wastewater treatment plant that's properly sized and is operating at the right times, pumps that are getting replaced when they need to be replaced, stormwater that's being managed in all parts of the geography and not just in the communities that happen to be whiter and wealthier. You know, that's the challenge. And I think part of it, you know, a huge amount of our work has just been daylighting how broken the system is. Because as Nicole knows all too well, we started looking into this and people are like, we don't know where the pipes are.
That's right.
We don't know who owns them. And it was like officials telling us,
people,
not just the residents saying we don't know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of it is accounting for the parts of the system in these areas that are very fractured and trying to figure out who's supposed to be responsible, try to get them to the table in a single conversation, and then start on that process of building out, well, what should it look like?
Thank you. Anne, did you want to jump in there on?
No, I think it's been covered well, but yeah, it's some places it's just been set up to be so dysfunctional like that. It's really disheartening.
Yeah. We did have a question come in asking about the viability of rain gardens and I think more broadly green infrastructure in the kinds of severe flooding events that we had. And I'm happy to share my take and then would welcome it from others. I think the primary benefit of nature-based green infrastructure systems is in smaller duration storms to capture water before it goes into the sewer system. And if we had enough of it distributed across the landscape, then in the smaller rain events that we have more frequently, you might very well have very little water going into the sewer system. But soil, just like pipes, can get full of water, and when rain gardens or any other nature-based system get fully saturated, they just don't take more water, and they need time to drain. And if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days of consecutive wet weather, the soil can't dry out, the plants can't do their job. And similarly, our hard infrastructure systems, our pipes can't empty out, the treatment plants can't handle it. And so you have releases into rivers and unfortunately into streets and basements, and you know the water needs to go somewhere. And when you have billions and billions and billions and billions of gallons of water, it really has to go somewhere. Here in Chicago or in Cook County, we had to reverse or forward, to pick your phrase, the rivers back into Lake Michigan, which happens. These days it happens about once a year. It used to happen more frequently, but now the volumes of water are higher because we're getting bigger storms. And this year in particular, I think, because Lake Michigan is so high, my suspicion, and I haven't talked to anyone at MWRD about this, but my suspicion is they had to wait a lot longer to let the river get high enough so that when they open the lock, it would actually flow into the lake, as opposed to the lake, which is at historic highs, flowing back into downtown Chicago or Wilmette. So rain gardens, nature-based green infrastructure absolutely do help for some kinds of storm events. And in large enough events, they get to a point where they're not going to do much, but honestly, neither the pipes or anything else if you get to a storm that's as big as we've had and consistent over a few days like we've just had.
Yeah. And I think that really points out the need for sort of, you know, a comprehensive set of distributed measures. You need both the nature-based solutions and big gray infrastructure as well to handle these complex problems.
Yeah, and I love how Anne brought up that point, because I was going to say, and as Nicole knows too, that Centerville is one big nature-based solution, right? I mean, the whole area, if you go down there, it's very green. It's very almost rural in feeling. There isn't a lot of impermeable surface, and yet water is everywhere. It is saturated. And part of the problem is the gray infrastructure was either never built out or it was allowed to completely decay over the years. And I think the analog in Chicago is that, you know, we have parts of the city that just didn't get any investment to maintain or build out some of the gray infrastructure. And yes, those areas should definitely get nature-based solutions to try to solve some of the problems, but they're also in many ways do more than their fair share at this point of investment of the gray areas that other communities have gotten historically over the years. And so I think part of what our groups are trying to look at is, what has that distribution been? Is there a real disparity and gap that is accumulated over decades in what work has been done to help communities on the south side of Chicago versus what's been done on the north side? Or has there just perpetually been a bleeding of resources to that part of the city? And then how do you build the political will to then, in some ways, make up for that long backlog?
I remember having a.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
you know, we do a lot of work in energy as well, and I think there's a real parallel there in that, you know, as you move to in the energy sector, we want to make our system more resilient and cleaner, and so we are trying to take a big system with one kind of solution and add on other solutions and try to decentralize that system a bit, but we still need the big solutions too sometimes. So I just feel like there's a lot of parallels between the ways we're trying to reform these various systems to be more resilient.
I remember having a conversation with the village planner in one particular southern suburb of Chicago, and we were working on a whole array of flooding issues. And I asked him if he could have a conversation with their public works department to determine the last time that they essentially vacuumed out their sewer pipes. They have a combined sewer system. And they looked into it and looked into it and looked into it. And this is a community that has existed since about 1850, and they can find no record of ever having hired anyone or having the public works department do that work. And what it creates is a situation not unlike cholesterol buildups in your arteries, where you lose the designed capacity of these systems, and they can get to, you know, 20% of what they were performed to do. And so you've just lost all that capacity. Westchester, which is in the west suburbs of Cook County, I remember was looking at a huge investment in new capital infrastructure, and they were going to do all this big stuff. And they had a conversation with the previous director of MWRD, and he just asked, when's the last time you cleaned out your pipes? And it had been decades. And so they did it, and within months we're experiencing like 10% of the basement backup service. That basic maintenance is what stuff that doesn't get done. And I do wonder, as we think about stimulus and putting people back to work, I hear a lot about capital projects, and I just wonder if it would be faster to get people back to work, and perhaps more immediately beneficial if we put people back to work doing this basic maintenance and just executed contracts for cleaning out pipes. And the same extends to green infrastructure too, where I know the more and more we build of it, the more and more we have concerns about how will that be maintained, and will we pay for it. So.
Yeah, and Nicole and I have discussed the analog of pipe cleanouts. In Centerville, they have surface ditches that run everywhere that are supposed to direct the floodwaters, the stormwater. And instead of directing it, they have gotten so filled with silt and with trees that they virtually create new paths of rivers that, in one instance, we have a photo, it's completely, the river went through a house that is now condemned. Because a levee area was left so unmaintained that the water just started spreading across the land. And I think, again, you know, not all of this is about building new stuff or even repairing, you know, the hard stuff, but cleaning out what we've already got and making sure we have an accounting of what we've got.
Yep. A question specific to the StormStore example I brought up. What are the things a developer will have to demonstrate to show that buying credits offsite will do no harm? So to be very clear, in this market, both the entity buying credits and the entity selling credits have to get a permit from MWRD and the municipality. On the buying side, that real estate developer, we are developing a no adverse impacts test to demonstrate that by not having all of the required storage at that one site, it will not have any negative impacts in the area. They are almost certainly going to have some storage at their site where they build, probably for their volume control. It's essentially their landscaping, managing some water on site And essentially any redevelopment in Cook County, if you're redeveloping a parcel that hasn't been developed since the 50s or 60s, even just meeting that improvement through your landscaping and your volume control will lead to a positive benefit in stormwater reductions from that site. So there should only be a positive benefit, but they will have to go through this test to demonstrate that there would be no harm. On the flip side, the supply site has to demonstrate, you can't just dig a hole in a field and call it a supply site and sell credits. You're going to have to take water off the streets, off the sidewalks, off the alleys in an area with known flooding issues. You have to solve a known problem in order to get your permit, and only when both sites are permitted can that exchange occur. But that is what we are working through with the technical committee for MWRD and getting that no adverse impacts test down pat. So, we have another question here about, I think the question is about, can we do something a little bigger than small steps? The question is, you know, we see things like when it's raining, you know, don't take showers, don't do laundry, whatever. And it feels like that takes so many people to make a big impact that perhaps it raises some questions of why to do it. What are the reasonable things that homeowners or communities can do that can scale up to meaningful impact in a quicker sort of way?
Disconnect those downspouts. It's a weekend project.
And can you talk a little bit, the history of Chicago and downspout disconnections? It feels like the policy can change with administrations or even within administrations, because it feels like we've gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Can you speak a little bit to that history and where you think things may be now, or where they may be headed, or where they should be headed?
Yeah, I don't know so much about the history, but yeah, I've heard that. You know, I think they're headed towards a general policy of not doing that anymore. It just, if you've got some permeable surface to put that water on, it's you know, it's just a basic design in the new construction that it's just one little piece of a new construction design that needs to change. Yeah. And so I think to the extent we've got more green building and such going on in certain areas of the city, you know, that's one of the things that would be taken into consideration. But yeah, it is mostly a retrofit issue.
I will say too, I mean, some of it depends on where you live, right? Because if you're advocating for an area that's been underinvested in, there is power in the collective action around saying to the new mayor, I want your water department to assess where it's spending its money and spend more in my community, and to get your neighbors to do the same thing. And also, you know, to sort of multiply on the example that you gave of like, well, I'm one person and flushing my toilets, you can become that annoying person on your neighborhood listserv that says, hey guys, I don't know if you're thinking about this, but maybe don't flush your toilet, or maybe like nobody's showering anyway during COVID, let's extend that once the virus ban, you know, those types of things are just like, because a lot of people don't know still. Yep. I mean, it's amazing how many people don't know, but I do think, you know, from the work that I've done in Chicago, there is a different listening ear now. And if you are living in a community that's had chronic problems and you have critiques of the water department and the things that they have not done to solve the problems, now is the time to start raising them. Now is the time to start making noise about them, and you know, get as many of your neighbors to do the same as you can. I think it's different in the downstate area if we have any folks joining from there. Like I mentioned, Nicole has done incredible work literally buying emergency pumps to help people, and the neighbors are mobilized to deploy those pumps to help each other if they can. I mean, that's some of the joint community action. I'm sure they're analogs to the kinds of kind of rain ready measures that that folks like CNT and Elevate are doing on the north side too.
Well, it's interesting. We got a simultaneous comment from Cheryl Watson, who's a great community leader in Chatham, about the challenges of downspout disconnections because properties are so close together. And at the same time, a colleague texted me that in their neighborhood, if they do the good citizen thing and go sweep leaves and garbage out of the grates so that water can get into the sewer, all it does is speed up the water getting into their basements as opposed to sitting out on the street. And so I find what's really hard to be an advocate talking about solutions here is that things are so context specific to the land, the soil, the topography, the community, the land use types, you know, the property ownership types. And it makes it really hard to say, yeah, you should do X until you really get on the ground and look at the specifics. The back and forth on the city's disconnection, downspout disconnection, was that they sort of blanket said, you should do it. And so people started to do it, but they were disconnecting their downspouts and like aiming them at their neighbor's basement foundations or discharging them directly into like a drain out on the street, or people who just didn't have any vegetated surface were doing this and the water had nowhere to go. And so then it backfires and people say, no, that doesn't work. Well, in that specific instance, it didn't work, but it likely would somewhere else. But that, and I know this is where Elevate's work and CNT's work and others, I think, would like to go, is the sort of consultative home, you know, property owner and neighborhood based approach, but to do it so comprehensively to really make a difference seems like such a massive undertaking that again, it feels like if there was an ever opportunity through stimulus to get some real money to try and do this at scale, maybe this is it.
I mean, it's to make clear that the capacity is so lacking and there's such a gap between getting from the knowledge and the skills and the abilities to do that real careful local look. You know, I think that's the challenge, right? Is like, can we take what might be this big shot of money coming from the feds and states saying we've got all of this to work with, to say, like, for places like Centerville, we're starting to understand what's going on there now in a more comprehensive way. Let's really fix it this time around. For places like Chatham, saying, like, we get that you have these very specific problems. We're going to get you the help that you need to really figure out what the solutions for your community are. And then to do it all with the overlay of, for the folks who are holding the primary responsibility or the purse strings, who are doing the distributing, who are doing the oversight and the follow-up on where that money goes, say, do it with an equity lens. Like, make sure that when you're doing this distribution, all of it is focused on bringing up the folks who have been at the bottom with respect to water services and making sure that they are in a much better place after all this happens. And, you know, that might be pie in the sky, I don't know, but I think what, again, that the virus brings home is that we haven't been investing in these places enough. We haven't been investing in the nuts and bolts of how our infrastructure works to the scale that is really needed. And if we don't do it now, if we don't take this opportunity to do it now, things are just going to get exponentially worse again. And the next time around, we're going to be, you know, off the charts in a worse place.
Yeah, and I think it does take some patience with that money too. We may have a recession that lasts a couple of years, so there is room to be patient with that money. But in that, you know, you have a big problem that's going to take a lot of work to fix. If you're using the distributed, some distributed solutions, it does require, you know, the time to go to people's homes and help them figure out what the specific solution to their specific problem is. So I think as we think about stimulus and such too, it's not only we need a lot of it, we need some of it really fast, but we also need some of it that can be a little bit patient to take the time to fix the problem right.
Nicole, were you going to jump in there?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
No, just listening.
Okay.
Hey, Nicole, there was a question about insurance. And I know, Nicole, you've talked to the residents a bit about the challenges of insurance. And I mean, I think the question in the Q&A was more about, you know, how can insurance companies incentivize spending on prevention and not on filling claims? I know some of my colleagues have looked at that more from the big kind of disaster FEMA type of flood insurance. But I mean, you found that essentially, I mean, flood insurance has been a real controversial topic down in the Centerville?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the residents don't have insurance. So a lot of them have tried to get flood insurance. So Centerville is not in a floodplain. So a lot of insurance companies either one won't give them flood insurance because they're not in a floodplain, or two, if they do, it's so cost prohibitive that the residents can't afford it. And then some of them even with homeowners insurance, right? They've been flooded out so many times that they just can't afford it anymore. So many of them, because all the residents that we work with are homeowners, with the exception of one or two. And so that's out of about 60 people. And so a lot of them don't have homeowners insurance anymore. So yeah, homeowners insurance, flood insurance is a huge issue because that goes back to the issue of repairing their homes, right? And so getting these issues fixed, they're paying a lot out of pocket. And a lot of them are on Social Security or disability. So yeah, it's a huge issue. And it's not very helpful, honestly. Insurance is just it's a barrier. Yeah.
I think those who are worst off just get more and more in the hole.
They do. Yeah.
And the insurance system does not really serve them the way it's set up.
And to be clear, this ties back to the equity issues, because then it makes it impossible. If the American dream is developing equity in your home, your private home that you own to pass down to generations or sell or whatever, you just can't do it.
That's right.
You can't get ahead of the repairs, and probably you can't ever sell the home. Because you have to disclose all these issues. And this is playing out here in places like Midlothian and other places where just this chronic repetitive damage erodes any ability to use that property ownership as an intergenerational wealth transfer, which is how families build wealth over time.
That's right.
The question is, have any insurance companies participated in helping with solutions? And I genuinely don't know about examples from Portland or Shangri-La or anywhere else of insurance companies getting in and trying to do something different to be proactive and help on the prevention side as opposed to the damage claim side. Does anybody here?
I mean, one thing I'll note, and this is where sort of I think, again, a one-size-fits-all policy advocacy position doesn't do it. I have a lot of colleagues who advocate at the federal level to support relocation as opposed to rebuilding in areas that are particularly flood prone. I think what we've seen come into conflict with that in the work that we do in Centerville is that people are very committed to place, right? And in instances of communities who have developed very close-knit connections to each other over time, and who happen to be in a racial minority group or other disadvantaged group, oftentimes it's because that's the only place they've ever been allowed to settle too. It's the only place that's been accessible to them. And so I think, part of the insurance question is not just, can we move these people somewhere else where they're not going to get rained out again? It's recognizing people's connection to place and connection to physical community and each other. How can you develop a policy that maybe provides a safer place from a water perspective, but also allows people to stay in the places that have become home to them, that have become community to them? How do you thread that needle? And again, I don't think we have perfect solutions yet, but it certainly says, for all the communities that are experiencing chronic flooding of one kind or another, the answer is not to move them to high ground necessarily, or that can't be the only solution. So we have to figure out, how can we keep some people in place? And Centerville is it's an amazing example of that. The residents will speak very, just in a real heartfelt way about why they want to stay in this place, despite the fact that they've got flooding and raw sewage all over their homes. It's because they support each other. It's a relatively safe part of their area. They've known each other for decades. Like I said, it's green, it's beautiful. They want it back to the way they knew it when the system was working better.
When we set up the Cook County Land Bank a few years ago, there were early conversations, and I don't know where they went, to be honest, about a closer partnership between, say, the Water Reclamation District and the Land Bank to identify homes in flood-prone communities, to identify the areas in those communities that were not flood-prone, and specifically acquire properties there, and then try to do more or less what you're describing, Leah, of enable folks to stay in their communities, but get them out of the specific home that's in the low spot or what have you. And it still seems like a strategy worth pursuing, but I don't know that anything's come of it yet. I think our buyout program in Cook County is still fairly nascent, and I think it's literally just a buyout and good luck to you. I don't think there are wraparound services to try to identify homes in communities or anything like that. We have a couple questions left. One very specifically about water quality issues, which I can address since I'm sure folks are concerned. So when the Chicago River or the Calumet River, which can also happen, discharges back to Lake Michigan, do the water intake cribs take that water in? The answer is yes. They surely take some of that water in. It's not a direct, where the water comes out in the river and where the intake cribs are separated by a large distance and a lot of water. But there is some interaction, but the treatment process that happens at the water treatment facility is, in theory, sufficient to handle the kind of matter that's in there. And I should note that by the time water discharges from the river back to the lake, it's largely stormwater. It's like a 99-to-1 ratio of stormwater to sewage, because the sewage clears out of the pipe system as quickly as possible. None of that is me defending the situation. It's simply an explanation that there's not a lot of interaction between the CSO water and the drinking water. There's assuredly some because it does mix, but it's not like the pipe goes directly into the drinking water supply.
Maybe, can I jump in on one drinking water aspect of bacteria? I think one thing to flag in case people haven't been following this is that there are significant concerns that once the shelter-in-place order lifts, we may experience a lot of bacterial contamination of drinking water sources because water has not been flowing through pipes in areas that people have vacated, like largely downtown areas and things like that. And as Nicole also knows far too well, if you don't have, if you have pipes that are both vulnerable because they have openings in them and you have not enough chlorine flowing through those pipes because the water isn't getting to where it needs to go with adequate pressure, you can have harmful coliform outbreaks that can cause a whole nother set of infections and problems. And so I know that that's definitely on US EPA's top of the list for coming out of COVID water-related concerns. Nicole referenced that there's a drinking water concern in Centerville. If you imagine that all the pipes that are the drinking water pipes are running right next to these open ditches and broken sewer pipes. And so, we have a lot of concerns that there are vulnerabilities in the drinking water system. So I think more communities will probably start learning about not just lead in their drinking water, but bacteria and the things that need to happen in terms of securing the pipes and making sure adequate treatment is flowing. So that we don't also face that kind of a health threat as well.
The Illinois Department of Public Health sent around, I think, draft guidelines, maybe they're final, but I think they're draft guidelines the other day for flushing building systems. And one of the observations we had is a concern that it seems to put all the responsibility on the building operators, which there are many, many, many of. And so one, they have to hear about this first. And then two, they have to have the ability to actually do what is in the guidelines. And so the recommendations back were more or less about, you need to have wraparound communication service. You have to get this out, and you have to have the water utilities do their work to communicate to this, multiple languages, visuals, all this sort of stuff. Because if you're relying on every building operator in the state to do this safely, whenever I don't even like reopen. I think the term should actually be unclose, but whenever that happens, it seems like a real gamble to be counting on this huge population of folks. So I want to be conscious of time. It is 4:58. I want to thank all of our speakers today, Nicole, Malia, Ann, for being with us, for all of you who attended today and on our previous two sessions, and for the speakers from Elevate Energy and NRDC on the previous sessions. Again, this was recorded, and we will post the full session for all three, plus a recap, plus some additional resources. We'll post that to our site. Elevate and NRDC may do the same, and we'll send it out to everyone that registered for all three, so you get all of the information. Really appreciate everyone's time, effort, the work of every one of you. These are real issues. Rainy season's not over. This is the rainiest May on record, and we've got 11 days left, 10 days left, and chances are next May we'll beat this year's record too. So these are issues we need to work on. Do find out what's happening in your community, and I will say federal, state, local officials in many communities are particularly interested about where they should go with building back better from the experience of COVID-19, and this is the opportunity, if there ever was one, to get their ear and talk to them about what you'd like to see for the future. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Stay tuned for follow-up email with more resources. Bye all.